Thank you all for being here. Thank you, IAF. Thank you, Gulam Saab, for having us with you. It's not often that we have the honor of sharing a stage with you. And this is indeed a very big privilege. I'm just going to make a very small introduction, which is to perhaps request you to what we have 1 hour. We have 1 hour to try to encapsulate more than 6 decades of an extraordinary artistic career. Not only artistic, pedagogic. अभी जैसे कह रहे थे मैं पढ़ता रहा पढ़ाता रहा, and this is really perhaps the loop of his discovery of art and what he has shared with us as his audiences. Teacher, writer, poet, thinker, artist, and if one looks at the exchange of letters between Gulammohammed Sheikh, he's a very young man, with those before, the group of artists that had gone before, the curiosity, the engagement, the intellectual investment is very apparent. Many of you are very young. Some of you may be just seeing the show for the first time in NGMA. It's worth looking for certain things. And one is his aesthetic language, the bridges that he manages to create between seemingly disparate categories, Mughal art, and the thrust and aggression of Indian cinema, Sienese painting and Shekhawati murals, Basoli, or the delicacy of Kangra, and the violence of the headlines of Indian newspapers. They are simultaneous in Gulammohammed Sheikh. And if you read further and look at the writings of John Clarke, Peter Maddock, Chaitanya Sambrani, and so many others, the critical reading is the worlding of Gulammohammed Sheikh's work. The many, many contexts that he's able to unpack and share and create what is such a distinct aesthetic and a distinct worldview. तो ये पढ़ता पढ़ाते वाली बात आगे करेंगे Indrapramit Roy, who's going to perhaps take us through the first part of the talk and the introduction to Baroda.
Thank you. I'm particularly privileged that I happen to be studied under Sheikh Bhai for, it was supposed to be 2 years, but I did it for a year because he was on a sabbatical for 1 long year on very important work at the US when I joined. But that 1 year proved to be crucial. And I've been part of the Baroda scene since 1987, so with a little 5 years off in between. So I've had the privilege of a ringside view of some of the developments that has happened, and also know a side of him which is often not talked about is the Sheikh Bhai as a teacher, Sheikh Bhai as an author, Sheikh Bhai as a thinker. We refer to him as Sheikh Bhai, so please excuse me for continuing that. And many other roles. And then you also get to hear stories and narratives which are very important in the making of an artist. So sometimes we talk about art as something very academic, but there are a lot of fun parts and also revealing parts which sometimes comes across through these little narration anecdotes. And one of the things that I think is very crucial and central to Sheikh Bhai's practice is being situated in a city which is off the grid of the major metropolises, and yet a place where cosmopolitanism flourished in a very peculiar way. It is it's a headquarter of a princely state, and it developed into an industrial hub. It is not what it was 60 years ago. And that is the town where Sheikh Bhai came to a place which was just a fledgling university, and a department of fine arts which became part of that university for a particular kind of a vision that the first Vice Chancellor, Srimati Hansaben Mehta, had. And what was his response and what the takeaway from those initial days is something I think that colors him as a person, as a human being, and ways of thinking. So it would be nice to begin there, that you came as a boy from Surendranagar into this sort of comparatively bigger city. And you found yourself in the midst of a cosmopolitan crowd. And just if you could share an anecdote or two to give us an idea of how that triggered certain things which stayed with you for the rest of your life.
For me, to reach Baroda itself was a kind of a, what shall I say, a life-shaking experience. As though I was being born. Because the 18 years that I had spent in a small town in Saurashtra, I had studied in a school with some art teachers and some poets. Baroda opened up literally a whole world before me. And I realized it in a day, not only in the very first year, but almost in the first few months. First of all, I was intimidated by the English language. I was not used to speaking English, although I had taken English in my matriculation examination. But speaking was another matter altogether. And all our teachers spoke in English. So I made friends with my seniors who knew better English than me in order to learn both what my teachers were saying, at the same time to get my ears about what was going on. I think Baroda, as you rightly said, had a kind of a, if not an international, but at least a national climate. Because the students came from all over India. Even in that year, in 1955, there were students from Delhi, students from Bombay, students from Calcutta, students from all over. Besides, there were what we call senior fellows, like the non-collegiate students who came to study under a particular teacher. Shankho Chaudhary had attracted Sharbari Rai Chaudhary to come there. There was another Bengali, there was another Bihari, then there were people who came from, very, so what do you call them, very, very specialized schools. And they were all working. The atmosphere was of work. And the second word, if I may use for Baroda at that point of time, is that it was like a large family. There were these teachers whom you could access any time. They were all very different, each one. Like Bendre, my own personal teacher, was a painter. And you would call him a painter's painter. Spoke little. But we knew that he painted almost every day. In fact, in the very college, in the afternoon, when the classes were over, he would put the screens aside and paint. And we would sneak in and look at him painting. Some of his paintings, like the woman pulling a thorn from her foot, which was after a Khajuraho sculpture,
Shakuntala,
was painted right in front of us. Mani Sahib was a simple man. He would sit down and talk to you. Now, these teachers never said, we'll make you artists.
That's K.G. Subramanian, Mani Sahib is, in case somebody needed to know.
So they would say, we can teach you all techniques. Teach you oil technique, teach you how to work in charcoal, in crayon, in pastels. You can do oils, you can do watercolor, whatever you teach you all that. But painting you will have to find yourself. What does that mean? They would say that you will have to search for yourself. And this began right there, in my initial years. There was an excellent library, one of the finest. I don't know, I had never seen other libraries. But I found such a library with world art open in front of you. Great volumes with wonderful illustrations. And there was a kind of a easy, liberal air around. For me, it was a very different air because I had lived in a very closely, sort of a kind of a society which was comparatively far less liberal. And here everybody talked about art. So it was not that you talked about religion, you didn't talk about nobody would say that I'm going to a temple or I'm going to pray. But everything was almost like prayer. That means the painting itself, in that sense, was part of our life. So if I were to quote Muktabai, the great saint poet, like she says, I eat God, I drink God, and I sleep on God. So I would say, we drank art, we ate art, and we even slept on art. And literally, Indra, I tell you, the studios were open 24 hours. There was no issue of what you call security. Boys and girls worked together from different regions, and as you know, that friendships emerged through it. All kinds of friendships which even turn into liaison, and we found many of them. And in those days, Jyoti Bhatt was married to Jyotsna, and then Parimu a Kashmiri got married to a Gujarati girl. So for me, it was a really new experience, almost like having taken a new birth.
Right. But and before you went to RCA, shortly after that, you were also started teaching when you were still a student, which is quite exceptional. Because this thing that you talked about, a village boy coming to a city and getting exposed to a certain cosmopolitanism, is an experience, and also the language as a barrier and then slowly opening doors, is something that is experienced by generations of students after you. And you are one of the earliest batches of students. You're talking about 1955, the university started in 1950. So within the first 5 years, this thing has already happened. Now, you started teaching. That is another very important aspect of his. Before we go into the works, I think we'll just touch upon it, that while you were still a student, while you're still a student, you shared with me once that the dean then said, "Tum ek taraf padho, dusre taraf padhao."
I will tell you the story.
Yeah.
When I was in my second year of masters, I was doing painting. But there was a teacher called Ratan Parimu, who was my senior, who was going abroad. And my Professor Bendre, called me and asked me whether I would teach. I said, "Sir, but how do I teach? I am still studying." He said, Hindi mein bole, "Kya ho gaya? Yahan padho, wahan padhao." He said, "Teach here and learn from there," which meant they teach in the junior classes and learn in the senior class. And that is how I did my master's. I completed my master's. I was asked to teach a subject which became my favorite, as I had not ever taught myself, never in my life. It was my first experience of teaching. And some of my friends also became my students. Vivan Sundaram was one of the students who became a lifelong friend at a later stage. I was asked to teach what is called story of art. And of course I knew, because I used to frequent library, and I knew the book Story of Art by Ernst Gombrich. But I had to make my own story. So in a way, I started teaching in a way where I could take my students along. We had illustrations on the board, and I will talk to them. One of the things that I discovered was that students came from different social strata. Some had been to places like Doon School, but others were from a tribal region, from Chota Udeipur and whatnot. How do you deal with them? So some students came to me and said, "Sir, can you teach us in Hindi?" What do I do? I said, "Yes." But on top of it, even somebody came and said, "Sir, you are a Gujarati, will you teach us in Gujarati?" And I ended up teaching the same subject 3 times in a week to 3 groups of students. It was my greatest and my most favorite period, where I was communicating with students from different groups, all kinds of students. Students who had not even heard of Mona Lisa. For them it was something totally alien. And there were those like Vivan Sundaram knew about Jackson Pollock right in very first year. So you had to deal with such a situation. But in the flush of youth at that time, I was perhaps 5 or 6 years older than my students. Vivan must have been 18 or I was 22, 23. So it was also a one-to-one. We were all in the same boat, as though. And we were discovering art. And in the end what happened, and I sort of initiated a process that every one of them would make a copy of a picture that I am showing. So I'll give somebody a Byzantine painting, mosaic. I'll give somebody a Roman painting. I'll give somebody a Pahadi painting. And they all made these copies. And can you think of it, that at the end of the year, we had the entire history laid out in their own illustration. So they would know, even the person who came from a very remote background was able to recognize, "Sir, it is Byzantine. Is it?" And I said, "Yes, you are right." Now that is how my story began.
Yes.
We thought that we could perhaps run through a few slides, and this is Indro, you might want to move your chair back, as should I, because we are blocking the view. Sorry about this. It is a remarkable painting. We have followed it, looked at it over the years, and seen there is the integrity of what you're saying in terms of the passage of ideas.
Yes.
I read this wonderful essay which was translated by you and Mala Marwa. Your mother coming home, the way the body is severed in the absolute foreground, the jinns, the burak, and the structure. It seems so highly arrived at, and this painting is 1966. It is, I think, dense with a certain kind of a maturity. There is also a personal investment in the kind of image making. आपने लिखा हुआ था about Surendra Nagar, how you studied the wall. This is a fascinating detail. Opposite Ghulam Saab's house, which he will probably tell you a little bit more, there was a wall. और दीवार पे जो दरारें पड़ रही थीं, or the cracks in the wall, or the way the wall matured over the years was something that he observed with great fascination. But he transfers that onto the lines of his mother's face, aging, coming home after a long absence. Please tell us about this work.
Well, as I said earlier, the 18 years I spent in Surendranagar were somewhat erased when I reached Baroda. But they came back to me when I was looking for, as our teachers told us, think of yourself. You want to paint something? Find your own idiom. So I began to think about myself and my own story. And actually, when I returned from England in 1966, I even began to scribble my memoir, which is called Returning Home or Going Home. And so it came to me that I could paint my own story. What is wrong with that? Earlier than that, I was told, and all my predecessors, many of them, painted one single subject or one view. But can we have two things simultaneously? Sometimes diverse, not similar to each other. And that came to me something like a collage. So for instance, in this, I began to dream about a kind of an atmosphere of a kind of a small ghetto with the houses huddled. Then there was a tree. So I brought in a tree over there on that side. It's a peepal tree, which is a Ficus religiosa. Buddha sat under and prayed, as you know. But it was a tree which is a common tree all over. Then I thought, what would I bring in? And I thought of a tree which I could borrow. Where would I borrow it from? I found it in a Mughal painting. It is a chinar tree which is from Kashmir. And then I had seen a Persian painting of Prophet's Flight. And I painted the Prophet's Flight above there with copying that little miniature. But then these angels were hovering about the chinar tree. As you can imagine, or you can see, that the houses are painted in one manner, the tree in great detail in another, the chinar tree in a third, perhaps the Prophet, which is like a Persian miniature, in a fourth. But if you can make out over there, there are chimneys of a mill, which was beyond the wall. We lived surrounded by a wall. So there is a wall, and that whole ghetto there, and there, I had taken photograph of my mother, and I planted that photograph right below. So in a sense, it came to me returning home.
I think there are two important things here, because you published a collection of poems with the same title, Ghar Jata, which is about returning home. So obviously returning home is something that has been very important, and I think both physically and metaphorically, because it is also a search for roots. What happens in this first slide is that we see the seedlings of your mature style already in place. You've gone through a phase where you were doing something quite different, which is sort of, I would say, proto-cubist manner with very thick paints, which was very fashionable international language at that point. So this shift has happened already, and this painting in a way embodies that. Now, and in the shift, you see the things that will stay with you for the rest of your life. One of them is the multiple realities. The other is also a sandwiching of influences or citations from different sources. So would you like to say something about how you did this and what significance it has to also slightly your other facets of you that is rarely talked about in the art context, is that of you as a literature, as a poet, as a writer in Gujarati?
Well, writing was a different story altogether. In my young days, I had written in what we call meters, very sound Sanskrit meters. I had also written what we call songs. But when I came to Baroda and met someone called Suresh Joshi, a wonderful writer and a teacher, when I met him, he asked me whether, have you read Lorca? Have you read Mallarmé? Have you read... No, he just rattled out names after names. And I said, no sir, I have never heard these names before. So he pulled out a book for me, a book of poems of Lorca. Take it home and read it. I tell you, it has two results. One, that I learned better English because I read the book fully. And second, I was able to enter into the soul of poetry by reading some of the best world-renowned poets. And that affected my poetry. So I changed. I gave up meters. I started breaking meters and started writing in a kind of a free vein, what you call free verse. I was very severely criticized by my colleagues and my critics because as though I was doing some violation to the language. But that is the way my mentor, Suresh Joshi, actually he too had broken barriers. And he had written a short story or short stories without a plot. So that is why that was a modernity in a way. But we went through the entire grind of modernity. I painted series of horses. I used, palette knife instead of a brush. I made paintings in, all kind of, thick paste and everything. And we had been groomed on Picasso, Braque and whatnot. You can think of, Rothko and others. But I had to find my own voice somewhere. And that is what led me to discover something in traditional Indian painting. And I felt that some accretions of those paintings, or those paintings in which I found a world, did exist in our life. That means something which was conveyed. And I began to think of, as you said, time twice. That time and our time. Perhaps somewhere, even in this painting, I was hinting at that because I am taking the time of the 15th century and time of 20th century, my mother. So that is how it began.
It's very interesting that when you're living in Baroda, there is close proximity with an artist like Bhupen Khakkar, and the subject of the urban, the subject of the city, the subject of the street starts to dominate. So if we are looking here at maybe the 70s, this would be a very, very fecund period for you. The little magazine, the writing, the study of the city as a subject, which stretches well into the mid-1980s, up till about 1980, from about 81 to 89. You do an extraordinary number of paintings about the streets of the city of Baroda. And what we as voyeurs can look into, we have one or two of them on which we can share. The combination of the architectural detail, which you do in such minutiae, is very interesting. You spoke about the Baroda-Bombay axis, getting onto the train overnight, landing up in Bombay in the morning. And some of the influences could perhaps, certainly the way the streets are shaped, they could have come from the Art Deco kind of buildings of Bombay. But then again, the vividness of the palette, the structures of the houses, the removal of human elements at this phase, where was this located in your sort of social and poetic imagination?
You have asked two questions, so I will answer them one by one. First, it is the palette. we are used to understand colors in terms of spectrum, that you have that range. And that range perhaps defines some aspects of the way in which you deal with color. What I discovered by looking at some of the Indian paintings was that it did not use the system of spectrum. Then what was the system? Was there a system? I began to think that much of the painting, like Rajasthani painting, which is very strong reds and yellows. So it was like if there was a very strong red, it was like chili. Eating chili, red chili. So if it was yellow, it was like what we call turmeric, haldi. And it was actually made like haldi. And I began to think that there was a thermal quality to color, which means it was temperature that was guiding the use of color. At what intensity, at what level you use color. You lower it down at what, bringing the temperature, you heighten it, and much of the Rajasthani painting, especially Mewar painting, was at a high pitch. You see those great paintings of Sahibdin, and you realize that everything as though it is like the hot sun, or it is like eating very, that kind of a food which has a lot of chili in it. But otherwise also, a kind of a body temperature. And that made me feel that I should also use, why should I not use my colors as I feel it, as I feel its temperature? Second, I think it was politics. We were more or less told that we should keep away from politics. Art has nothing to do with politics. And that was a time in 1975 when the entire community, not necessarily artists alone, was shaken, because when emergency was clamped, we lost freedom of expression. And that was a point at which we had to turn to it, that we cannot be without politics. We cannot even be apolitical. We have to incorporate some aspects of politics. We don't have to give up our art. No, our art also would not get polluted if politics enters in your art. There are artists like Max Bachmann, and there are so many others, who have painted entire group of Mexican muralists were very deeply political. So in this case, when I started a painting of this kind during the years of emergency between 1975 and 77, I had begun with a man with multiple hands running away. Perhaps it was in response to the emergency. But eventually, I found that that figure did not meet the demands. And I removed the figure. Only the houses and only the animals. So it was a desolate kind of a landscape which we saw day in and day out in those days.
Full chroma, the combination of cinema, the street, and the kind of energy that the city has generated, which is also threatening. It's not an easy energy to deal with. Do you want to comment on this also, Indra, on this particular work? This entire body of work from the early 80s to 1989 has an emphatic color palette, which has become even more pronounced. And the threat, so to speak, in which figures, communities seem to be pushed towards the corners of the edges of the building, the edges of the frame. The vertigo-inducing kind of rendition that you have given to the buildings, the loss of balance, so to speak, or a loss of equilibrium, socially seems to be implied. Would you like
I
to also
think
add
the
to this?
clue is already given by Sheikh Bhai in that thermal quality of color. And that thermal quality kind of reached a crescendo, then it reached a plateau. And then in one of the works, which is almost entirely in grey, that was based on Ahmedabad, with just one burning image of a vehicle somewhere in the top center, where it sort of takes a different turn altogether. But I think the thermal quality of the color is something that you are consciously cultivating, and that became part of the voice and part of your oeuvre, because you are talking about time which was disturbed and which kind of far from the India of the dreams that we had, or at least your generation had, the first after independence generation who thought you were building a new nation which will be syncretic, which will be multiple, which will honor multiple belief systems, and it's based on not one story but multiple stories. And that was already sort of undercut by certain things, by political movements, by short-sightedness of our political leaders, and also socially there was an undercutting of that thing happened. So I think they are kind of interrelated. It's a conscious choice, I would like to believe.
And also the pushing of the architectural elements to the corners and allowing this turgid frottage of the street to sort of completely take over the frame.
Well, here I have attempted something different. As far as the language of painting is concerned, it is comparatively towards a kind of quote-unquote naturalistic or realistic. I have even painted the figures which are almost life-size. Or figures, if you were to look at it from about 10 feet distance, you would identify with. So that was my intention, that a painting of this side, this is by 10 by 7. So when you stand in front of it, the big figures would be more or less like inviting you to be in. So you are also within this whole circuit which is painted here. I was trying to paint a city I had lived in for now almost 20 years. And city was vandalized, brutalized, to an extent that at one point a journalist commented that the city of Baroda has the dubious distinction of having largest number of communal riots in a year. How do you cope with that? There are these three figures who meet over a match for lighting a bidi or a cigarette from different communities. But as you know, lighting a match is also fire. So it has incendiary connotations. And then there are so many things like on top there are these women whom in the words of, if I were to translate it from wherever I have learnt it from, but perfumed mistresses. And from those, please go back. And from there on the left, if you move, there are the riots raging. There is a man who is being denuded to see whether he is circumcised or not. And there it comes down, as you see that the structure from there follows down. People follow from the streets right down where a woman is selling vegetables. But right in the middle of it, there is a cinema hall where a film called Silsila is being shown. A film about love affair of matinee idols, which is being played up in public. And there is a painter who sits in the middle, right at the center, painting the eye of the main actress called Rekha. I was quoting the scroll painters of Bengal. who carry with them a scroll in which the figures are without eyeballs. And when there is a death in the family, they go to the family and tell them that they will come and ritually paint the eyeballs to release this soul hovering, sightless, and
So they have sight in the netherworld.
Give it sight. But here there is no eyeball, which means it's also killing as well as reviving. In some way, it was the image of a city which I thought almost for sale, like that woman was selling vegetables.
These are a suite of 3 paintings which are very much within the same ethos. But we wanted to bring these in because they seem like they also contribute to what will follow. Your big, ambitious works, the stepping back in a certain sense. You want to go back to the previous one?
No, you want to show this first?
We can show this first, but also talk about the density of images. We're just running a little short of time. So Indro suggested we should just
Mappa Mundi.
We should land up in Mappa Mundi, which you turn to 13th, 14th century Europe for inspiration, but also the compression of detailing, which we see in the previous 3 works, becomes even more acute. Entire worlds. So we can think of Jain mandalas as well. We can think of Haveli painting, and we can think of the way the figures become extraterrestrial. For me personally, this is a remarkable feat whereby the most significant figures, Kabir or Majnu or Saint Francis, are outside the frame. They are extraterrestrial. What was the composition? How did this come to you? Because this is genuinely the area of entire world's civilizations coming together.
Well, I think after having painted cities, I had this notion of painting the world. How can you encompass the world? So I looked for maps, and I found one called Abstop Mappa Mundi, a 13th century map made in Europe. But it was a Christian, it had Christian connotations, with the head of Christ at the top, and his hands on the left and the right, and his feet at the bottom. I did not want to make any religious connotation. So, with the newly explored medium of computer technology, digital technology, I began to work on that map by removing borders, adding my own images, and bringing the world in a way. Perhaps some idea of healing was in part. So I reconstructed the map again and again. I have done it 24 times. I've even done large paintings. But who are the cardinal figures? You have in the maps there are winds. In my case, I have brought this eternal lover called Majnu, who is looking for his beloved everywhere in the world. And I brought poet Kabir, who had, alongside weaving woven words in his sakhis and in his couplets. I brought in Mary Magdalene from the painting of Giotto, who was still looking for Christ who had come out after resurrection. And there was a man from the hills who was dancing freely. So in some way there is also element of liberation of sort. So there comes inside that map Ram chasing the deer. You will see St. Francis teaching or speaking to birds, and you have such figures like Majnu and the old woman. So I began to construct a kind of a new world for myself by using the map and changing it again and again to different formulations. This is one of them.
Indra, do you want to go at
Yeah,
this?
this was something that I saw happening in front of my very eyes. It's a very, very large work, and it's meant for the then newly built Vidhan Sabha building of the Madhya Pradesh, Bhopal in particular. And this was the entrance to the assembly hall. And this is that Tree of Life motif, which has, again, talking about that layering, that references going back to Bhimbetka, which is like 5,000 years, back to something very contemporary that has happened in that decade of the Union Carbide tragedy of Bhopal. And also everything in between. So it encompasses, anyway, a lot of references and citations, which is the hallmark of your storytelling, because you wanted to bring all that, multiplicity of voices that constructs it. Without going too much into the detail, would you like to give us an overview quickly of what all you wanted in there?
You see, the original inspiration came from my desire to paint a life-size tree. So when the invitation came from the Madhya Pradesh government to cover a space of 31 feet by 21 feet, I thought of a tree, because the tree would rise up to that level. But I could make it a tree of life, we could bring whole life into it. Why not? We could use maps, we could quote things. But at the same time, it was the wall of the upper house of the Legislative Assembly, Vidhan Bhavan, where the legislators sat and perhaps defined our future for common people. So I painted legislators on two sides, on the left and on the right, the women on that side, the men on this side, and as Indra has already said, that they would discuss Union Carbide or the Great Narmada Dam. But only one thing I would point out to you. On the right side there is a chair, which is the chair of the legislator, so to say. But what I am doing is to quote from an ancient tale called Simhasan Battishi, the story of King Vikram. It is said that when Vikram tried to ascend the throne had multiple dolls, women, figures. And one by one they came out. No, please, go back. I will come back to that. I will take only one more minute. That dolls came out here, they are all over that throne, telling in the story, the dolls were telling Vikram that you got to deserve to be sitting on that throne. I thought that was an apt symbol for the legislators who are sitting in that chair. Anyway, we'll go.
My apologies for that. We had actually wanted a blow-up of Vikram. But we did have that, but it's somehow been removed. We wanted to show that episode of Vikram and Mehta.
Which one?
We can move on to.
We can move on to probably one of the most enduring figures that Ghulam Sahib has actually engaged with, and that is the figure of Kabir. We know that over the last few decades, at least the last 2 decades, the figure of Kabir has been instrumental through his music, through his poetry, through even the walk that you engaged with Tipaniya, and going through several villages and understanding what was the great enduring attraction of Kabir, a late medieval figure, with people so many years after. I read the Muslim scholar Safi, who says that the two most enduring figures in the poetic imagination of the followers of Islam have been Rumi and Hafiz. Aapne liya hai Kabir or Rahim. Their simplicity, etc., would probably be, and you quote it very interestingly. But there is the inverted tree, and there is the poet Kabir. 2-3 things, 1 or 2 questions. The stolidity of the body is evacuated, and within him he carries the worlds. So the worlding within the bodily frame is now being sort of demonstrated. If you would like to comment on that. And all the architectural elements that we see of the past, the mosque, the temple, the city, the streets, the industries, are somehow embedded.
Well, the body in itself is a motive for Kabir. He uses the word ghat. Ghat means pot. But the pot stands for the body or the self. But here I have made the body transparent so that the entire landscape behind it becomes part of his body. So in a way, each one of us carry with us our own world. All our bodies are transparent. And you can implant as many things as you like. In Kabir's poetry, he always says at the end, Kahat Kabir, says Kabir. Suno bhai sadho, oh, good people, listen to me. That is what he says. There is also this Upanishadic quote, if I may use that word, called Urdhmul Adhashakha. When world turns upside down, the trunk goes down and the roots go up. Kabir used a kind of a poetry which was called Ulat Banshi, which means upside down. So much of his poems are about that. So, in a way, since I made a series of Kabir paintings, this is one of them. I tried to reach Kabir in my own way. Actually, it was very difficult before embarking upon Kabir. But then I thought that if Kumar Gandharva can sing Kabir, can't I not paint? So I went along. I made my own Kabir. But this is not actually Kabir, but this is a magician and a kind of a, whatever you call it, some belonging to some belief system. And they are both looking at a tree, which is a mythical tree. There are all kinds of trees in our myths. I am making my own myth, my own tree in that sense.
But Kabir is fascinating for another reason. He seems to ally with the kind of metaphor you use for walking. You have Kabir walker. He is barefoot in a lot of your works. He's walking, and he could have come from Central Asia for all we know, or from Banaras, it doesn't matter. You use the metaphor of walking even then with your kavars. Because after all, the kavard has to unfold, and it's a perambulatory art. The narrative is perambulatory. You use the metaphor of walking even with Hyun Sang, when he comes in from China in your large work called City, and Hyun Sang then becomes witness to sites of violence. And you use the metaphor of walking with Gandhi the great walker. So,
and Majnu.
And Majnu, yes, of course. But also the kavard, the adaptation of a vernacular art form, popular in Rajasthan and Gujarat, into something much more ambitious, something much more contemporary and political.
Well, there are multiple questions. If it is walk, let me connect it with Gandhi. Gandhi always walked, continually. And at one stage, when I thought of whatever, if you were to think of icons of our time, I thought of Gandhi. And of course, I thought of Kabir. So in some sense, both of them join hands. And I tried to project them together. The covered, which is a portable shrine, this structure, as you can make out, was a kind of a device to get away from the flat painting and paint on multiple level and in each work you will have something like 26 sides. So each work will have 26 paintings. And so you can keep on moving them, closing them, opening them. If you close it, it becomes a box, like a magic box. When you open it, the whole story begins. This is a cover on Gandhi, the early life of Gandhi, which I have quoted. And there is a place from where he began the Dandi March, again on foot. So coming back to walking. And that is something which partially incorporated in this work.
Covered as box.
This is how it is closed. Yeah,
it's magnificent. And you cite your own work. We have 2 or 3 more covered slides. And the unpacking of the box.
Yeah, you
These
see
are
the box.
over life size. So.
Yes, they're...
In the previous slide, you saw the closed box. Now it is open on one side. This is the closed box.
Yeah.
And this particular cover I made in order to be able to walk into it. Not as an object, but something you would be surrounded by. So you would walk into it. So it is about 7 foot high and about 24 feet wide. And there are so many doors on which multiple images are portrayed. Some images, as I call home, are from my own paintings, my own previous painting. So this is the one that you saw, the picture of mother. And that painting, there are other painting called Speaking Street. So can you go forward? Yeah. But at the back of this cover, I have quoted representatives of multiple belief systems. From Hinduism, from Islam, from Christianity, from Buddhism. There are all these characters quoted from different paintings. Some of them were as small as 2 inches in a miniature. Some of them were as about 10 inches high in the paintings of Duccio. I made them all life-size. So you could relate to them as you look at them. And it is a kind of an assembly. People from the left are looking at right, people from the right looking at the left, as though they are conversing. So it is a sangat, which means sitting together, talking together. The only way for the different belief systems is to talk to each other. If you open yourself and learn from the other what the other stands for, perhaps I think there is some healing. So this is at the end of this. And that cover was made for you to walk in. Each individual can walk, and there are images inside and up there.
Speaking across centuries, but I think our last few works were about this, the conversing across centuries. This is also something we take from Mughal painting and Sufiana depictions of the saints, that from the 12th century to the 16th or 17th century, they could be sitting around in a circle and conversing. Here you give us Kabir and Gandhi and these very turbulent waters. The idea of the ark, in a certain sense, is it an abandonment of the terrestrial? It's a mythopoetic idea. It draws from Islam, it draws from Christianity, it draws from many sort of cultural roots. But this kind of composition, what would you like to share with us?
Well, this is part of the same cover. And in this, you are right, absolutely, there are multiple references. At one level, it could be called an ark. Whether you want to call it Noah's Ark or your own ark. But it is an ark.
And then this
At the other level, it is a boat. There is this 18th century painting by an artist called Nayan Sukh from the Himachal region, who had painted a boat. in which a ruler is carrying his kingdom in a boat. So I thought, that's an apt metaphor. Why do I not bring that? So I am quoting that boat from the painting of Nayansuk, but only boat. In the boat, I have made a kind of a lake. In the lake are all those figures you just now saw. In real life, big figures. Those are tiny figures again sitting in front of each other and talking. And then the boat, as we commonly say in the Hindustani, Jivan Naiya. The life itself is a boat. They are always constantly sailing in a boat. So there are the waters all around, what you call Bhavasagar. Or there is a town which is hanging above. In my case, it was my hometown. So I took photographs of my hometown and I used them. So in a way, it has multiple connotations, perhaps some of them simplistic, some of them metaphoric, some of them abstract, but they are all there. Well,
great, magnificent, and tremendous in scale, and more references. But the figures on the right represent a sort of a community of humanists, if you like, scholars, poets, painters, thinkers. We have, it is a community which is sort of balancing one end of the entire spectrum of human civilization. Indro, I'm sure you have something to comment here.
Yeah, I think this arc is a sort of, it covers almost all nationalities, the myth of the deluge, the destruction, and the regeneration of life. So, but it's also like you very aptly said, that the boat that contains it. This is also increasingly to me looks like the boat that carries your lifetime's experience. You know, in a way there is, since the cupboard home, there is a sense of you looking back and looking and counting, you know, the things that have been like mileposts in your oeuvre, in your worldview, in the way you would like to look at the world. There are disappointments, but there are obviously heartbreaks, but there is also great hope, and the myth of regeneration is always there. If not centrally, then it is in the margins. Sometimes it moves to the centrality of the figure. And looking at those identifiable figures that you've clustered on the right side, and they're spread all over, that you can have these markers. They all have references. They've all been quoted one way or the other in your early body of work. And this seems like one place where they're all coming home together, to roost together, and to sort of perhaps guide us in these turbulent times. And we do have two more close-ups, and with that we will end the presentation and open it to, if there are any questions coming. We will still have 5 minutes, I think. So if you can just quickly sum up.
Gayatri wants to
I just want to also talk about the centrality of the tree, and this central tree and the figures and the faces that you have embedded. This is an earlier work as well, outside Niharika in Baroda. The friends, the value of friendship and community.
Well, I don't have to repeat that it is the boat that I have borrowed again from Nayansuk. I am forever grateful to this great artist for allowing me to use his boat. I am using this boat in my own way. I want to convey some meaning that comes to my mind. So I am using that same format. But here it is a different story. May I say that sometime in your life, you come to a point where you feel, let me pack everything, let me put everything together and sail off. I think somewhere in our mind, everybody carries that desire to go somewhere, to travel, to traverse, to move, God knows where. But we have some kind of secret desire. This boat, in a way, carries all the great artists whom I admire. Ambrogio Lorenzetti, Leonardo da Vinci, Rabindranath Tagore, Francis Sousa, you can see them.
Yeah.
Only living artist is Kentridge. All others are artists of the past. So, I bring together as many of them together, packed in a boat, my boat, in which they will all come. Gandhi turns away. There is also my friend Bhupen Khakkar, there is Frida Kahlo, and there are so many others. And if you go on the other side, little further, I don't know if you go, see the previous image.
Oops.
No. We'll get there.
We'll get. Please carry on. We'll try and get there.
No,
Indra, we have to do
no, you can't go back, okay?
We
No,
can.
we are not going to that. Yeah. Gayatri referred to speaking tree, which
Yes.
is again my favorite motif. So I keep using it because it also stands for life. As the tree itself is life. Tree is a motif of life. Although I am using an image in a different way, that in the paintings I have brought multiple writers and others. In the tree itself, as you see right in the center of the tree, there are heads. These quotes, you remember I mentioned my mentor said, have you read Rilke? Have you read Mallarmé? They are all there. So I brought them somewhere later in my life. But then I thought that if I have to pack up whole of my life, not my life alone, what would I have? And I keep on constructing this with all kind of structures. Even Kabir comes there, there is Kabir is sitting there. But the whole forest is there at the left. If you were to see it in a manner that on one side is all greenery, the trees, and on other side all artists. They seem to balance each other. And they are in a rocking sea. The sea is different now. This sea.
Yeah, it's a roiling sea. It's perhaps more disturbed than the earlier seas. It's roiling. The waters are turbulent.
Turbulent waters, yes.
Turbulent.
But then there are, there is a Maya Mruga over there, flying. There is also somebody, jumps into the sea to swim. There is also Jonah and the whale over there. There is also a saint who guides those who are lost. So, there is turbulence, of course. But there are guides, there are others who could sail across.
Perhaps you're also suggesting that if there is a pralay, if there is a great flood, what will survive will be art and humanity, because these are the figures that represent those kinds of virtues or those kinds of qualities. We have to wind up. I don't know how to thank you, but perhaps you would like to do that.
Thank you very, very much. It sort of, in a way, comes up in circles.